Hello, so Lambda functions in Godot, also known as the anonymous functions, are functions without names. Sounds crazy, I know, but Lambdas are a feature of programming that are so beneficial to every single developer. Because as a developer, we are always looking to improve our workflow, code efficiency, and be able to condense our code to make it simpler, but keeping it just as effective. And Lambda functions do just that. They are pretty simple to get the hang of once you learn what they are, how they work, why they work, and when to use them. So today we will cover everything you need to know about Lambda functions in Godot. Here is a complete breakdown of today's tutorial. We will start by learning what Lambda functions are and why to use them. Then we will move into step-by-step tutorials in which I will explain how to use them and when to use them in Godot. But let's not waste any more time. Subscribe to help YouTube push this tutorial to other aspiring game developers, and now let's learn all about Lambda functions here in Godot. So what are Lambda functions? Well, it's important to know that there are all sorts of different Lambda functions that can range from really simple to pretty complex. Now, Lambda functions are functions, but they aren't functions that are declared in the global class scope. In other words, it's like a one-line method that may be needed at a certain spot within the script. A really simple example of this that you have most likely seen and used many times before would be when you use the filter function. If we are filtering out the even numbers in an array, that is done with the use of a Lambda function. But the real magic of Lambda functions are when we make them into reusable undefined functions. And this is done through callables, since lambdas are used to create callables, meaning a simple expression that you may need to use all throughout this script. So an example of this would be creating a variable which basically just stores a function. We can then easily call this and use this function all throughout the script. You may be saying, well, that looks kind of useless, DevWorm, but we can then take this a step farther. So maybe you have a calculate function, which could call for different operations. Those different operations can be stored within callables and easily pass through to the calculate function by just passing that callable variable through. But don't stress, because I'll dive much deeper into this example and so many other examples later on in this tutorial. But hopefully through those two simple examples, you can get a better idea of what Lambda functions actually are and why they could be used. Okay, so now again, why do we use them? Well, because it's much quicker to create a Lambda function for a specific need than an entire function. It also saves clutter in our script and in the class's scene tree, as the Lambda functions won't exist at the class level like other functions. And the big one, it'll help make our script more modular. Understanding when and where to use Lambda functions will drastically help you to improve your workflow as a developer, since they help to make code more readable and efficient. Lambda functions are also really going to help you to keep your scripts organized and keep different methods and information in one place, as we will learn about creating local lambdas. Now keep in mind, with a smaller script, lambdas aren't really going to matter as much. But if you do, or when you do have a pretty complex script, it'll save you from having to jump all around the script looking for functions or creating new functions for different needs, as it can all be done right then and there. So it is important to learn about them now, so in the future when you are creating super long complex scripts, you'll be able to keep everything organized, and trust me, it'll save you so much time. I can't express that part enough. But let's stop talking and actually get to creating, because that is for sure the best way to learn. Okay, so now we're in the tutorial section, and I want to start with the very basics. And throughout this entire tutorial section, I have ordered it in a way which I think it'll be easiest to follow along and learn with. Like, for example, I want to start with going over lambdas and variables, or in other words, a callable, because they're pretty simple and they're going to help us understand lambda functions and how they are, what they are, and that's going to end up leading into our other examples, which we're going to be going over later. But what we have in our current project is just a Node2D. That's all we have. There's no scripts, no anything else, right? So to start with this tutorial, we need to actually have a script, because that's where we're going to make use of Lambda functions, right? And I'm just going to call this our script.gd here, because it is going to be the only script in our game, since everything that we're going to be going over today will be done within this script. But I want to first kind of go over how we actually write lambdas and like the very basics of it. So I don't know if you saw, but earlier we went over basically a function stored within a variable. That's kind of what we're going to go over now. So to understand how to write it, basically we need to understand what is happening. Well, we're going to have a variable, right? So what is happening within this variable? Well, let's say we wanted our variable to store a number, we would say equal to 8, right? Let's say we wanted to store a Boolean value, we would say, well, equal to true, right? But let's say we wanted to store a function, we would say function. And then we would just drop down, and then right here we're going to be within a function, just like if we were to create a normal function. So for now we can say pass, but just like down here, if we were to say function hello, right, and then do that, colon, and then click enter, we're going to be tabbed over. So we're going to be within that function, right? But within a Lambda function, it's the same thing, but it's just storing that function within this variable called our Lambda. So within this our Lambda variable, or within this Lambda function, what can we say? Well, let's just say print hello world for now, right? Well, how are we going to call this? Like, we know how we call a normal function, but how are we going to end up calling a lambda function? Well, let's create a ready function so that we can see what happens on start if we were to call this. So on ready, we can say our lambda, we have to get that variable, and then we can just say dot call. If we do dot call, then you're going to see what happens if we click play, right? It's going to print hello world in the output because we are basically running this function whenever we do our lambda dot call. That variable name and then calling that variable name, we will run this function. So there's also another important thing that we should understand, that we can pass arguments through callables, or we can pass arguments through lambda functions, because this is a lambda function, but this here is technically a callable, if that makes sense. So we can pass messages through, or variable arguments through it. So we can pass through an argument here called message. We can end up printing off that message, and then to pass through this message, this is basically like calling the function. So we're calling the function here, and we can pass through our message here. So maybe we want to print hello world. So we're gonna pass hello world to this message argument, and then we're gonna pass that basically to this print statement. If we were to click play, you're gonna see what happens there. Hello world is printed. Now, I want to walk you through another example because I think it'll be a little easier. This is just kind of basics. Hopefully you can understand how they're written a little bit better, because it's basically our variable, or it's a variable that stores a function, and then this is basically how we call that function. That's the basics of what I'm trying to explain here. So now let's go over basically some logic. So we can say our lambda now, and then we can basically say function, and then we can end up passing through a number for this example. And we can say, okay, well, we want this function to return our number plus 2. So we're going to take that number, we're going to add 2 to it, we're going to make sure it's an integer, and then we're going to return that value. So to call that sort of function, what will we do? Well, let's just print off what we're going to do here. So we'll print off our lambda function dot call, and then we'll pass through just a number. So now it should take this number that we have here, add 2 to it, and then return it here. So it'll return it right here for this value. It'll replace this with the value it returns, and it will print basically whatever value is returned. So if we click play, you're going to see that it is going to print off 7 down there in the output, which works. What if we were to take this function and add it down here, and then basically put in 11? Well, you're going to see that we're going to get 2 different numbers down there in the output. We're going to get 7 and 13, because it's going to run this function up here each time we actually call that function to be ran, just like a normal function. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what is the point of this if it's just like a normal function? Well, don't worry, you will understand that when we get to more advanced examples later on in this tutorial. Right now, I'm just trying to get the basics across and really try and get you to understand what is going on right here. So hopefully you can understand what's going on, because of course, understanding the basics are going to be very, very important to moving on to actually using them within your own projects, or understanding how they're used in more complex examples. Okay, so now I want to explain how lambdas are used in parameters, and it's going to be really short, but it is very important, and I need to explain it before we move on to actually using lambdas and callables within custom functions. But what I want to kind of go over is this piece of script right here. So we've all most likely, again, seen this line of code. Maybe you've used it, maybe you haven't, but you've most likely seen it if you watch any Godot tutorials or anything like that, because filter is a pretty common function that I feel like is used a lot. And it actually makes use of a lambda function. This here is a lambda function, or in other words, it's a callable. But basically this filter function needs an argument. It needs to take an argument, and it needs to take a callable argument. So to create a callable argument, we actually just put in a lambda function. Understanding how this right here works is actually very, very important, because there is a ton of pre-built Godot functions that use a lambda function or need a lambda function, just like all of these that you see on screen right now. But this is kind of just a simple lambda function that takes the number and then is going to basically check which numbers are divided by 2, and it's going to return all the numbers that are divided by 2. So if we click play, you're going to see that it's going to print from these numbers, these are evens, right? Just because we have this print statement here. Okay, so this evens value here is of course basically just printing off what this here returns, because it is that variable, and that's why it prints it off in this fashion. But I want to do something now, and I want to test your knowledge. So I want you to pause this video and try and create a callable in this situation on your own. Now, let me give you 2 hints. You're going to have to create a callable. You're going to have to create a function stored within a variable. But after you do that, there's 2 ways you can go about it. You can either call that callable right here and set the evens variable to that callable, or you can just call that callable function right here in the print statement, and then you won't even need the evens variable, if that makes sense. So you can do it either way, but I want you to go on your own and try and do it. Pause this video, and when you click play again, I will show you how to go about it both ways. Okay, so how do we go about it? Well, we have this variable, which is evens. Let's keep this, right? So we're going to use this variable even. So we're not going to end up changing the print statement for the first example. But again, we do need to create a callable. So to create a callable, we can say var. Maybe we want to call our callable find the evens, right? And in find evens, we can, this of course has to be a function. We're of course going to have to pass the array variable through it because we don't know what evens we're trying to find. We need to be able to find evens from an array. So we can pass the array, and then we can basically just return what we have right here. So we're going to run this exact same function. So we can just return array filter and then we're going to return that value. And then down here in our evens function, right, we can say, okay, well, we have to call that find evens callable by saying find evens dot call, and then we can pass through the array variable, which is created way up here at the top. Now, evens will still be equal to the exact same value because it's basically the exact same thing happening. If we click play, you're going to see that everything works good. Now, we can actually just remove this entire evens line of code and this entire evens variable here for the second solution, right? So if you wanted to go about it without the evens variable, you would just remove that evens variable, and down here, instead of having evens, you would have to do find evens dot call, and then we can pass through again that array variable that we have at the very top, right? So that'll look like this. And if we click play, once again, we're going to get the exact same output because it is technically the exact same thing actually happening, but we are now making use of a callable. So that's the basic of lambdas and parameters, and hopefully you were able to get this correct. If not, it is okay. I hope you are starting to understand it just a little bit more. But now we are going to get into the most important part and the most beneficial part of lambdas, which are when we learn to integrate them within our own custom functions. So what actually do I mean by that? Well, this can be best understood if we create some different examples together. The first example being based around a calculator script, which is really going to help us understand the process in which we can use lambdas functions within other functions. And then after that, I want to go over one more example based around a player health script, which is going to kind of help to make it clear of how you can actually use this, what we're about to go over within an actual game, how it is actually used within actual games, right? So to get started with this calculate example, what do we need in a calculator? Well, we're going to need a function which is going to do the calculation for us. Now, in this function, we're going to have different arguments. Of course, to do a calculate function, what do we need? Well, we need a number, we need a second number, and then we need some sort of operation. Now, this operation is actually going to be a callable, if that makes sense. So if we were to use static typing, number 1 would be equal to an int, number 2 would be equal to an int, and then number 3 would be equal to a callable, because callable is a variable value, because you can store a function within a variable, which makes it a callable. So up here at the top, we can actually create our different operations that we can choose from to pass through to our calculate function. So for example, right here, if we were to call our calculate function, we can say, okay, well, let's put this into a print statement, but we can say calculate, and then we can pass through, for example, 7, and we can pass through the number 3, and then we need to pass through an operation. For example, what if we wanted our operation to be called add? Well, we need to create that operation up here within a variable, or by making a callable. So we can say, okay, well, var add is going to be equal to a function, and then we can pass through number 1, we can pass through number 2 into this function, right? And then what do we want to do? Well, if we have the operation add, all we want to do is just return what number 1 plus number 2 is equal to, right? And then down here, we can actually, inside of our calculate function, we can call the operation or call the callable that's passed through. So if we were to pass add into the calculate function, add is going to be now equal to call, or is now going to be equal to operation. So if we were to say return, because we are basically just returning the value of whatever in the outcome of this is here, right? So we want calculate 7,3 add to be equal to a single number because we want to print that single number. So we can just say, okay, well, let's return the value. So we can say return whatever the operation dot call and then number 1, number 2 equals, right? So if you see what's happening here, we have a calculate function. Whenever we call the calculate function, we're going to pass through two different numbers. We have to also pass through an operation. The operation has to be a callable that we've created. So for example, we created this add callable, so we can pass through that callable as our operation. So we can add these numbers. So down here, we're going to basically take whatever operation was passed through, we're going to call on that operation, and we're going to pass the two numbers through, and it's going to, this here is going to be equal to the value that's returned here. So it's going to be equal to the two numbers added together. And then we're going to return that value into our print statement and then print the value. So right here, 7 plus 3 should be equal to 10, if that makes sense, and it is. But the beauty of this is that we can create multiple different callables and choose between them. So for example, if we have a sub, we'll call it sub, but it really is subtracting, right? We can pass through those two variables. So number 1, number 2, and then we can return number 1 minus number 2, right? And then instead of putting add here, we can just say sub. So all we have to do is change 3 letters, click play, and you're going to see that we are going to return 4. If we go back, we put add, you're going to see that we're going to return 10. If we copy this line and we call this function 2 different times at 2 different parts of our script, we can do 2 different things, right? So we can subtract 1, we can add 1. Maybe we want the numbers to be separate, right? But you can do that, right? So it doesn't really matter, but now we have this calculate function, which has a number, and an operation. For example, if we wanted to create another operation, this is how easy it would be. So let's say that we wanted a divide operation. We can just say divide and then divide the two numbers from each other. Then down here, we can now say, okay, well, let's do 9 divided by 3. So then we just put divide, and you see how simple that is? So now we can now divide the numbers and get that outcome. So now we have basically a full working calculator by using these different operations. So we basically set up different operations, pass through that operation or pass through that callable to an operation variable, and then basically call on whatever callable we pass through and basically return that value to a print statement. So that is kind of how you can use them within functions. That's again another very basic, simple example. But how can you actually use this within like a real project? Well, I just went and created this example for us to look at. So it's a very, very simple example, but it is about player health, and this is actually something that you may use in a real game. So we have the player health variable, of course. We have 2 different callables, one to add health and one to subtract health, just like we had in the calculator function. And then we have a function down here, which is update health. This update health function is going to do the subtracting and the adding to the health. So if we're taking damage or if we're gaining health, we're going to use the exact same function here. We're going to pass through the amount, whether we're subtracting that amount or adding that amount. It doesn't matter. We have to pass through an amount. And then we're going to pass through the operation, which is going to be adding health or subtracting health. And then whenever we do that, we're going to set player's health equal to whatever callable is called and whatever callable that callable value returns, right? And then up here, I basically just did it by input. But in a real example, it would be if an enemy attacks and I have a take damage function, well, we know that the player needs to take damage. So in the take damage function, we would call update health, the damage variable, and then we'll subtract that health, right? We'll subtract that from the health. If we're regenerating health, then we say, okay, well, wherever we want to call the regeneration or wherever we want to change the health at in our script, for example, maybe it's on a timer every 10 seconds. Every 10 seconds that the timer goes off, then we would call this right here, right? If that makes sense. But I did just put it on buttons here so that we can kind of see how it works. If we click down, we're going to subtract health, and if we do up, we're going to end up gaining health. Just like that, and that works. But if you see, if we keep going up, we end up going way way past 100 health. Maybe we want a max health of 100. How would we end up implementing that into the game? Because that is something very, very important. And then that brings along another important aspect that I want to mention about callables and about Lambda functions right here, right? So for example, if we were to create another variable here, hopefully you understand how all this is working here. Hopefully I explained that well. If you do have any questions, then feel free to ask me in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you. But if we have a max health variable here, which is equal to, for example, 100, because we want that to be our max health, then down here in our max health, or in our add health function, we can create something that is more advanced than just one line, right? So we think of Lambda functions as one line, and I hope that you're not thinking of it just as being one line, because whenever it's done within a callable here, it can actually be as long as you want it to be. So for example, we can create, or we can actually just remove all of this to create it, make it simple for us. But we want to create some logic in here. We want to create it like a full function. Basically, let me show you the logic. So if we get the absolute of player health minus the player max health, this is going to equal a number. And if this number is less than or equal to the amount that we're trying to add to our health, then we need to just return player max health. And if we return the player's max health, basically what that's going to do is set the player health to the player's max health, meaning we can't go over the max health. So for example, if the player's health is currently equal to 80, right, and the player's max health is equal to 100, well, that will be negative 20. The absolute of negative 20 is 20. Let's say the amount is equal to 40, so we're trying to add 40 to our health. 20 is less than 40, meaning we will return the max health. So we'll return 100 instead of returning 120, if that makes sense. But if this does not come back as true, then we do want to just return the player health plus amount. So for example, if our player's health is equal to 20 and we subtract 100, that'll be 80. That'll be negative 80. The absolute of negative 80 is 80. 80 is going to end up being less than the amount that we're trying to add, right? So I think we messed this up here. So let's see. So 80 is going to be less than the amount that we're trying to add. No. 80 will be more than the amount that we're trying to add, right? Because 80 is, I was thinking of negative 80 for some reason, but it's the absolute. So 80 is going to be less than 40, meaning that we'll go to the else statement and we'll return player plus amount. So we'll return that 20, that original 20 plus the 40, which that means our health down here will equal 60. So if we were to click play and we were to click down and then we were to click up, you would see that every time we click up, it's going to be maxed out at 100. Now, I know that it's like a perfect even number, so it's like 80, 90, 100. But even if we were to, for example, say that we were adding 15 health, right, just to give it, to offset it a little bit, you're going to see if we go down and then we go up, we're at 95. If we go up, it's still only going to go to 100 and it's not going to go to 110, if that makes sense. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense. But now I want to move into kind of local lambdas. And if you do, again, have any questions about anything we're going over in this tutorial, feel free to ask in the comments, because I do really want you to understand lambdas because they are so beneficial. So if you're not understanding anything or you're having trouble understanding, please ask questions, because no question is a silly question. All questions are serious questions, and I will be glad to help. Okay, so now I want to go over briefly local lambda functions, because they are just a thing that you should know about, and I just want you to know that you can go about lambda functions in this way. So for example, just like you can create local variables, for example, if we were to create a variable current power and then we were to create that as a float and then equal it to like 0.8, right? This is a local variable. This variable can only be used within this function. We cannot use this variable with any other function. So like, for example, if we had function math2, right, and then we were to pass through number as well, right? Well, in this function, we don't have access to this current power variable. We would have access to it though if we created it in the global scene, but we don't create it in the global scene. So we don't have access to it because it is within this function, making it a local variable to this function. So we can only use it within this function, right? So in the same way we can do that, we can create local lambda functions. For example, let's say we have a lambda function that stores our formula and it executes our formula. We can say var formula, which is going to be equal to a function. We can pass through our number through that function, and then we can create or do some sort of formula onto this function, right? So maybe we want to divide it by the current power, and maybe we want to times it by some random number, right? We can do all of that just like that. I feel like that's too close to 2, so let's do something like this, right? But we can have some random formula. Basically, it's going to take the number that we put, it's going to divide it by current power, and then it's going to times it by this number. But if we come down here and we take the number that we're passing through our math function, so if we take the number and we apply that formula to the math, or to the number variable, so for example, we can take our number and we can equal our number to the formula dot call number, just like we would do on any other lambda function, then now our new number is going to be equal to the formula and whatever the formula returns. So we're going to pass through it. Basically, it's going to take itself, it's going to pass it through the formula, and then whatever the formula returns is what the number is going to be equal to. So basically, we're going to take our number, execute the formula onto the number, and then that's what the number is going to be equal to. And if we print the number, you're going to see up here in our ready function, we're passing through 7 into our math. So it's going to apply that formula to the number 7, and you're going to see we're going to get some random number. Now, there's really no way to check if that's actually correct or not, but unless you do it in a calculator, which I'm not really going to do, but that is what it came out as. So this is technically a calculator, so it probably is right. And then if we were to change this to like maybe 18, right, then we would get some other random number based on however that formula goes about it, right? So that would be how you kind of create local lambda functions. They are the exact same as a global lambda function, but it's just within a script and or within a function, and it can only be used within that function, right? And there we go, the basics of lambda functions in Godot. Hopefully you can walk away from this tutorial knowing things that you didn't know before, or at least understand how and why lambda functions can be used, so you can come back and research this topic later. But I do want to leave you with one final piece of advice. Lambda functions are something that will help you improve your scripting and workflow, but they aren't a must need. But they do help make things much easier. And again, it is very important to know and understand lambda functions, because the sooner you start implementing them into your projects, the better at it you'll get. And over the course of a project, or over the course of your entire game development journey, you will be so thankful that you know and learned how to use lambdas. Again, if you have any questions about anything Godot related, feel free to ask in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you soon. Thank you so much for watching. I really do hope this tutorial was able to shine some light on lambdas and hopefully provide you with a bit of value. But until next time, stay safe and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. God bless and bye-bye.